Okay, so I guess we can start. I want to say hi to everybody who's coming from Europe and decided to join this presentation, and of course, Gilson for inviting me. This talk is called Ludic Unreliability and Deceptive Design. In case you want to follow my academic adventures, that is my Twitter account. As Gilson already mentioned, I am working in Malta mostly, which is that little island with a circle around it at the southern part of Europe. And we are running a research institute dedicated to digital games only, which is quite a unique thing in Europe. Of course, there's like 3 or 4 other research centers, but I happen to work in that one. To integrate a little what Gilson was saying, I used to work as a designer for the entertainment industry back in the 90s and early 2000s. I published around, I think, 12 commercial titles and helped other development teams with their games without being one of the designers. You might have played some of these games anyway. Then it came a time in which I decided to dedicate myself to the study of philosophy instead and leave the industry. Some of my friends considered that to be a poor move because, of course, I had a career in games. Why throwing it in the toilet? But that was not the case for me. I didn't see that as a waste, and I didn't see why the two could not collaborate with one another. As a matter of fact, also Matthias Fuchs is here and he does similar things. You can definitely use philosophical tools to look at game worlds and virtual worlds and play. But what I do in particular is try to go kind of the opposite way. So try to use my background in game design to, in a way, propose philosophical views, thought experiments to redigest our philosophical past, and perhaps give rise to questions that can only be asked with the mediation of digital interactions. I know that Gilson's class already played some of my stupid little games that try to prove philosophical points. If you have not, and if you're curious, you can find most of my papers and most of the games designed as philosophical arguments at this website. I've done it. Now that my little introduction is done, and we can focus on the matter at hand, which, as I mentioned again, is ludic unreliability and deceptive design. In particular, I will be talking about deceptive game design. I suppose that Gilson invited me to this talk because, of course, you are game makers or people interested in the use and the study of games in this class, and also my friends whom I invited over. So before I start talking about my topic, I would like to emphasize one thing, and that thing is that games are not a single thing, right? In your study or in your interests, in your hobbies, you might have figured out that not only games are a bunch of things at once, but also we can study and understand them from a variety of different perspectives. For example, we can treat them as something analog to toys. So devices that can disclose playful experiences. Somebody like, for example, Professor Fragoso, who might be here or might join later, uses games as media for storytelling, rhetoric, and education. So games can be studied and looked at as media that communicate with us. In case you come from a background in the arts, then maybe you can treat or look at games or study games as tools for personal expression. Instead of modulating the visuals of something like in the case of, say, painting or illustration, or the auditory, let's say, experiences of your audience, like in the case of music making, in the case of game design, you are in a way sculpting their possibilities to act, right? So it's let's say, the art of agency, as a scholar recently published on. We can, in case you're interested in making it into the industry, treat and understand games as entertainment products too. So we can definitely study games as commodities. We can, as you already saw in the previous reading and in the gaming that you've done this week on my games, treat games as, in a way, playable thought experiments that allow for a number of new perspectives on how we think and how we act. As you see, as you probably or might read in my book in case you ever decided to pick it up, and so on and so forth. So there are multiple ways to look at games, multiple ways to understand them and study them. In talking about ludic unreliability and deceptive game design, what am I going to look where am I going to look at the game from? What am I going to study them as? My answer is very, very basic. So I'm going to try to look at games as artifacts, right? What is an artifact? It is something that does not occur spontaneously in nature. It is an object or an experience crafted by a human being of sorts. Now, when we approach an artifact, any kind of artifact, like a bottle or a fork, we know that it was made for a reason, right? We approach it with, in a way, expectations that it serves a purpose. The ways in which we experience and use an artifact, any artifact, is primed, is biased by the idea that somebody made it with a purpose. And so we tend to expect certain functions and certain effects from it, just by virtue of being an artifact. If this sounds a bit strange, I'm going to try to make a few examples now. Take a boardwalk, right? This kind of path made of wood that you see in this picture. You know that a boardwalk does not, I suppose it doesn't occur in nature as it is. And when we meet it, when we find it in, say, a national park, we know that, one, we can expect we're going to have a easier way to walk on it rather than rough or wet terrain, and that it will lead us to a destination that is declared or informed, that we're informed about. So we come to walk on a boardwalk with a number of expectations. Another cultural object that we can look at in the same way is, say, a book. When we pick up a book, we don't address it as a mysterious object or maybe a construction tool. Instead, we know already, we expect that it contains words in a language ordered in a particular fashion that, in case we understand it, will produce a certain imagination and a certain experience for the reader. I'm going to go a step further and say even the contents of the book are artifacts. Small example. If a book spends a lot of time describing a particular tree or a particular village, say, then you know, as part of this kind of implicit relationship you have with the author, that the author did that for a reason. He or she spent a certain amount of time and a certain amount of pages on a particular detail because that detail is meant to mean something specific, right? So we encounter game contents as artifacts too. In case you are familiar with Russian playwright Anton Chekhov, you know that he wrote in one of his letters that, and I quote, "One must never place a loaded rifle on the stage if it isn't going to go off. It is wrong to make promises you don't mean to keep as an author." Very similarly, in another one of his books, he wrote something akin to this, and I quote again, "If in the first act you have hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one it should be fired. Otherwise, as an author, don't put it there." So I'm trying to emphasize that whenever we encounter something that is artificially made, we attribute a reason for that, and we attribute a meaning to that. So if, as an author, we do something meaningless, our audience is going to be confused. Instead of an actual gun, let's look at a computer gun. You know that if you pick up a certain gun in a video game, very likely the situations or the conflict that you are supposed to be encountering in the following scenes or in the following level can be solved or addressed with a digital gun, right? Think about the prominent position that it has, for example, in the viewport of a first-person shooter. You know that being the gun so visible and so central, you are probably going to need to use it. Similarly, if the end of a path of an adventure, in this case it's Bloodborne, like an action role-playing game by From Software, I think 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Let's suppose that your path leads against a closed door, right? Chances are that the player will expect to find a key to open that door in the area, in the vicinity of the door. So the author gave us, or sent us, in a way, an implicit message saying, hey, this is a closed door, there's something for you to do with it. It is not a coincidence that it's blocking your path. In a similar way, if we found a key in a video game, we are, in a way, trained to expect that there's going to be a door in which that key fits. We could say the same thing about the chest behind Link. This is a picture from Twilight Princess. Legend of Zelda, the Twilight Princess, of course. You do not find a chest in a game randomly. It is normally positioned in a particular room or in a particular area for a reason. It's normally a safe area in which you can enjoy the spoils of your efforts as a gamer. Again, this is Final Fight 2, a 1991 game by Capcom. You might recognize that when you find, as a player, in a game world, a large stack of, say, health items and weapons, something is about to happen. I would like to ask you if you know what that means, but I mean, we're not in a very interactive mode right now. I'm lecturing in front of a camera and so on and so forth. So I will tell you, you know, as a player, that means that a particularly difficult part of the game is going to come up, probably a boss fight, right? This is kind of a familiar way to build expectations about the game artifact that many of you as literate, experienced players have. So to summarize this part, if we understand the game as an artifact, that means that we look at it as something made by a designer or a set of developers with a certain purpose in mind. And normally it's like a certain experience in mind, right? And in light of that understanding, we are going to read object, characters, and challenges as meaningful in relation to that purpose, as being put there in the game world for a reason. As another example, if you fall into a room like this one in Portal, you are expected to be able to get out of it, right? So in a way, not in every game, but in most games, you are guaranteed that there's a solution. There's a way out from this room, right? This is a very different kind of expectation than if you were to fall in a concrete room in your everyday life. You would not have any guarantee of a solution or a way out. But in games, we have learned to expect that there's always a solution, there's always a possibility to get out of it, there's always a way out. Same thing with very difficult fights. You know that they were specifically designed for you to be able to defeat the boss in question. So they're not going to be perfect opponents. They will have downtime, they will have moves in which their guard opens, and so on and so forth. So if we encounter a boss in a game, we are guaranteed, in a general sense, most of the time, to be able to beat it. Maybe we're not just good enough yet, but it is not an impossible challenge. We expect a meaningful battle from it, and an impossible challenge would not be a meaningful battle. So to conclude this little bit on games as artifacts, I want to underline that if we treat a game as an artifact, so if we look at it and engage with it as if we were like a human-made object, we tend to impose certain meanings to it. And we tend to believe that it does mean something, that it was meant to be like this for a reason. And together with that meaningfulness come a number of expectations that we have towards certain game elements and how they function, what is expected of us as a player. This is built by the players. For example, you guys, you are players yourself, and you realize that you build expectations around games together with your game's literacy. So there's a way to, in a way, refine those expectations. So, since you're studying game design, my question, or rather the question that I want to try to answer is, how does a player build expectations and a bias towards meaningfulness in the game experience. So how do players build expectations and infer the functioning and the meaning of a game? I'm going to try to show you 4 different ways in which this happens, okay? So I'm going to show with examples 4 different ways in which players, in their relationship with games, build expectations and further refine their bias towards meaningfulness. First of all, we build these kind of expectations ludically. By that I mean through the experience of the game artifact itself. I'm going to show you a little example. What you see here is a screenshot of, I think this is Spelunky 1. And you can see a number of ways in which the game is communicating what the game intends for the player, what the game means for the player. For example, you see those kind of boards on the background of the game, which suggest certain actions. Okay, that would be a good action. If we look at the interface in the upper left corner, we see that, for example, there's a heart. That is normally the symbol for health, right? There's a symbol of a bomb, a symbol of a rope. So likely, in this game, your health as a playing character, a number of bombs and a number of ropes are objects of interest. They are meaningful in this exploration of whatever I'm doing in these caves. Below this interface part, there's also money. So money is probably also a factor here. Then we could, as a player, for example, try to fall on those spikes in those pits. And the game will teach us through feedback that that was not a good idea. Our health will decline, and we're gonna be, as player characters, repositioned in the level. So we can build a set of assumptions of what the game wants us to do, what the game values, and what is a good way to understand what's happening, right? And all of this information are coming from within the game experience. I could have made the same example, say, with Dark Souls, in which the act of dying, right, apart from being a very, very annoying and frequent occurrence, is also telling you, the player, that was not the right move, or you shouldn't have fallen from so high, or the enemy you're trying to face is too strong for your current level of skill or level of improvement of your character, and so on. So the game communicates and, in a way, refines the expectations of the player within the game itself. That is one of the 4 ways in which that happens. Expectations and information about the functioning of the game can also happen meta-ludically, so from material that exists outside of the game as an artifact. Some call this, for example, para-ludically in relation to, say, literature. And I'm thinking of ideas such as game trailers, posters, advertisements, comments and questions on forums of game communities. All of these things are not, strictly speaking, part of the game as an artifact, and yet, through those experiences, we can filter what to expect and what we are supposed to do and value within a digital game. These are other 2 examples of metaludic knowledge. This is a cabinet, arcade cabinet of Space Invaders. This is a 1979 game, so an arcade game that you would play with coins and so on and so forth. And back in the days when these games were popular, when these games in a way spearheaded the games industry, the kind of hardware and software they were playing with did not allow them a lot of memory for explanation or story or movies, right? Meaning that a lot of the context of where the game action takes place is represented on the outside of the cabinet. Are you seeing? So the title, for example, the fact that the world, whatever it is that we live in, is being invaded by giant dark creatures, and we presumably have to defend our home planet. So a lot of informations and expectations about the game are communicated to the players in a way that is outside of the game as an artifact. We could say the same about instruction manuals, right? So we get a lot of information on folklore and how to use things and what to value and how to behave because it's written on a game manual. And so far, we looked at 2 ways in which we can, as players, start to gather knowledge and expectations about a certain game artifact. Another of these ways is interludically. So having played a game by the same author or within the same genre, we can make assumptions and inferences about what a certain game means. I'm going to show you an example. When I was making this presentation, I went on Google Images and I looked for first-person shooter. So I don't even know what the name of this particular game is. However, if you've ever played a first-person shooter, and chances are that students of your age play several of them, you can already make a number of inferences and a number of deductions about what this game is about. So we see that there's a gun we're holding, so probably we will need to shoot back or shoot at enemies. There's a crosshair indicating presumably where we are shooting at the moment. In the upper left corner, we have a timer, so probably we will need to clear the area we're in or the level we're trying to face within that amount of time. There's health items straight in front of our viewport, meaning that we can be wounded and probably we can recover health in case we're close to one of them. And in the upper right corner, we can see some information about the gun, probably something to do with amount of bullet, amount of energy, cooldown of the weapon, and so on and so forth. I have never played this game, but again, I played similar games, so I can, in a way, make assumptions that I'm going to fight monsters, and the monsters are going to shoot back or try to attack me, and so on and so forth. I also make assumptions such as I cannot walk through walls or fall through ceilings, and so on and so forth, because these are general conventions that, in a way, mimic realism within the game genre of first-person shooters. I hope this is clear enough for you, and this was the third type of way in which we can gather information and build expectations towards a game. I'm going to drink a little bit of water before the next one. Okay, so last but not least, how do we build expectations about the game? In a way that is transludical. So it doesn't have to do with the specific author or a specific genre that the game we're playing resembles or that the game we're playing is by, but it is something that reflects a more general ludic literacy. I made you the example earlier of how the heart is the general indication for health, right? The more health we have, the more hits and the more, say, fall damage we can take. These ideas that the heart equals the health of my character or the player character is something that is not really specific to a genre, but it's like a more or less a generic convention that we all get. Think about how to move a camera, the fact that you can have double jumps and so on and so forth. Those are things that are common throughout many, many games in many, many genres. Now, this part is finished in the sense that I hope that you understand what we mean, that we can look at a game as an artifact, so something artificial, and how, in the specific case of games, users make sense and build expectation to these artifacts. And these are the four general ways in which that happens. I hope this is clear, and if you want more on this, there's a paper called The Implied Designer and the Experience of Game Worlds that Enrique and Nautilus read last week online as part of the Game Studies meeting. And all of these parts are explained in more detail. So if you want to go into further depth into this idea of building expectations and which are the categories in which we build expectations, you can find it on this paper, which is on the same website that I showed you at the beginning. If all of this is clear to you, and so far you trust me that this is going somewhere, then we can move to the next part of this talk. Let's go. Now, Gilson is training this class as a class in which you experiment with game design. So probably, I assume, you've also been exposed to what is normally considered to be good design practice. And it's not, and I'm not only talking about good design in game design, but what I'm about to tell you is true for industrial design and architecture and in any way that design is in a way involved. And good practice in game design, similar to those other disciplines, is the fact that good design is user-centered design. This is the dominant paradigm. What it means is very simple, very simply that given the amount of time and money that you have available, you should try to build whatever and design whatever you try to build or design on the basis of the expected use and the needs and the desires and the preferences of the intended users, right? So probably Gilson, when he asks you to design something, says like, define your target audience. Try to figure out how long they can pay attention to things, how many things they can keep in mind. Can they think strategically? Can they be shown explicit violence or not? Can then be shown sexual content, blasphemous content, and so on and so forth. The same goes for architecture, right? Think about it. We need to build a station for 1,000 people that is possible to be compartmented in certain ways, and in case of fire, people can enter and exit in certain particular ways. Again, user-centered design is functional design. It's design that is rationally directed towards solving a particular problem or need for a particular group of people. I suppose this is how, if you take game design manuals, this is more or less how game design is taught to children and students in general. However, one does not need to follow that paradigm. One doesn't need to follow necessary user-centered design to be a good designer. As a matter of fact, there are multiple ways in which you can design transgressively, so going against this canon. What you see here is a picture of Miguel Sicart, who, together with Douglas Wilson, in a 2010 paper, in a 2010 paper titled "Now It's Personal on Abusive Game Design," wrote that games can be understood as mediators, right? Something in between the designer and the recipient. And as mediators of this personal relationship, the game can also be ambiguous or sometimes even evil and abusive. What do they mean by that? It means that the designer can also go against the immediate interest of the player and prank them and tease them and put them in embarrassing, awkward, and sometimes even painful situations. So if you're interested in why a designer would like to have fun in that way, there's a 2010 paper that explains you how that is done. Another form of transgressive design is discussed by José Zagal and others, which you see pictured here. And this other paper is titled "Dark Patterns in the Design of Games." In this paper, still in the proceedings of FDG, Zagal and others focus on game features that intentionally exploit weaknesses and misconceptions in the players. Why is that interesting? Because through exploiting them psychologically and cognitively, you can make games that, for example, people spend more time on, or misclick on the wrong thing that make them spend money without wanting to. Dark patterns in design is not something unique to games, of course. It's like a more widely interaction design issue. But this paper in particular shows how one can design, for example, in casual games, according to principles that go against the interest of the player. So one could consider this to be non-canon, right? Good. So we showed two ways in which we could potentially go against the canon of good user-centered design. And now we talk about the core, the meat and bones of this presentation, deceptive design. Before I go any further, I want to clarify that deceptive design can be understood as a subset of transgressive design. So it's another one of those ways that we can go against, for reasons that I will explain, the common paradigm of user-centered design. Let's get started. All of this until now was just preparation. Oh, look at this. Games, especially video games, are not particularly reliable technologies. If you ever played a game, you know how often they lag, glitch, end up in situations that you wouldn't expect, such as falling through polygons or ending up in a death loop of some kind. So games can be unreliable in a way similar to glitch that is not deliberate. So the designers and the developers didn't want this to happen, and the games in a way betrayed their expectations. This is another famous way in which games can be unreliable. The game is functioning correctly, and we're looking at a screenshot of Skyrim by Bethesda Soft right now. But some players figured out a way to exploit an interface possibility that allows them to create infinite copies of any elements of the game. In this case, is big pieces of cheese. So what you see here are ways in which a game cannot be trusted that are not deliberate. The developers didn't want that to happen. And as a matter of fact, as you probably know, these kind of mistakes are constantly patched, which demonstrates that the designers didn't want them, right? But what if, and I'm asking you, what if we could design unreliable games? So we could have games with unreliability which is deliberate, which is wanted by the developers. So we're looking at designed unreliability. What we talk about today is deceptive game design. So the kind of game design that projects misleading and deceitful information about the functioning of the game. So the game artifact is telling you something, is suggesting a particular course of action or a solution or a way to act which is going to be successful, and then that is not the case. In other words, in deceptive game design, the designer, instead of being truthful and honest to the player, the designer lies to them. But, and this is very important, this is super important, unlike the cases that we've seen before of abusive game design and dark patterns in game design, these deceitful design decisions are pursued in the interest of the players. So we're not trying to have fun at the expense of the players or to trick them into spending more time and money with our product. No, we're trying to give them a better experience by lying to them. And you might be wondering, what does that mean? How is that possible? I'm going to show you a few examples after I drink a little bit more of water. Just a second. All right, better now. So let's see a few examples of how we can lie to our players in a way that favors them, in a way that gives them a better experience. What you see here is a screenshot of one of the beginning sections of Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, which is an action RPG by Ninja Theory released in 2017. Throughout gameplay, Senua, which is the character you see in this picture, is often hallucinating. She has a mental condition, and she's experiencing dissociative events. During the section of the game which I'm showing in this picture, one of the voices in her head informs Senua, and so vicariously also the player, that the dark rot or the darkness has taken hold inside of her. This sickness will keep spreading from her arms towards her head until nothing else is left of Senua. You need to understand that this scene takes place just after the first scripted death of the character. So a scene in the game in which you are supposed to die, and the game is going to throw enemies at you until you finally die. So this is a strong suggestion of the existence of what they call a permadeath mechanics. So the implication that should the player die more and more times, they might risk losing all their progress forever. So the game does not really feature a permadeath mechanic or any kind of long-term penalties for frequent in-game deaths. This information was planted by the designers, and there are interviews about that, to add gravitas, to add like an urgency in the way the players act and react to death, with the objective of increasing their emotional engagement with the game's outcome and making the idea of mental illness more salient in player experience. So in a way, we are lying about a certain mechanic as designers so that the players feel more at danger or more involved or more scared about dying. So it adds weight and gravitas to their experience. This was an interesting example. I'm going to propose a second one. In this case, it's an independent game made by some of my former students in Holland. This is called Waldo.io, and you can find it on itch.io. This is the second example I want to bring to you. Upon launching, Waldo.io prompts the player for a username that they can use, okay? After username has been put down, the game connects to the internet and automatically looks for an available multiplayer match. The username chosen, as you can see from the bottom part of this image, the username chosen will appear among those of its competition. Why is this deceitful and deceptive? Because Waldo is actually a single-player game. And the whole setup, so the fact that you need to input a name and then find a match and so on and so forth, is the deceptive part of the game design. On the game's itch.io web page, the developers of the game, in this case Mattia, explains their choice as follows, and I quote, "There is a fake lobby and the game generates usernames for everyone but you. We even went out of our way to make sure that one cannot play without an internet connection. And you know what? The multiplayer feels real. The other players are allowed to win, and sometimes they do." So I hope you understand how, by lying to the players, this experience became way more interesting and more probably enjoyable for somebody who's into competitive online games. So similar to how we started this presentation, I would like to, in a way, propose 4 different ways in which the designers can decide to be deceitful and lie to the players with their interest in mind. How can designers deceive players in their inferring functionalities and meanings about the game? And I guess you can already imagine what those 4 are. They can do so ludically, so by giving deceptive information that is gathered in relation to experiencing the game artifact. The 2 examples that I've just done, Senua's Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, and Waldo.io, are giving you, the player, information through the engagement with the game. So the deception here happens within the game, within the experience of the game as an artifact. We can also do it meta-ludically, though. So I can try to deceive the player as a designer by using paraludic or metaludic material, as I mentioned before, like posters, trailers, box covers, and so on and so forth. And here comes an example. This is the PlayStation 2 version of Metal Gear Solid 2, which is the follow-up of a very successful game on the PlayStation 1, which is, of course, Metal Gear Solid. In the first Metal Gear Solid, the player play war veteran called Snake, who's super cool and very, very experienced and powerful and great at sneaking and all that. So the belief that Metal Gear Solid 2 would be played as Snake was reinforced by paraludic material such as the box cover, like you see here, and various posters that were published before the release of the game, in which you see Snake being a central and a large presence in the picture. As a matter of fact, you see Snake in this picture is the big head floating behind it. However, that is bad news for the fans of the series, because only the opening section of the game is actually played as Solid Snake. Throughout the rest of Metal Gear Solid 2, the player takes on instead the role of Raiden, which is an unexperienced rookie, a lesser character, a non-charismatic character who is treated as an imbecile by his superiors. That's great. So the designer of the game, or at least the creative director of the game, Kojima Hideo, was interviewed about this very controversial decision. Like, you made a blockbuster game and everybody's been waiting for years to play another Snake game, and instead you give us a lesser stupid character. So when asked in this interview whether he was concerned about the fans' reaction to this design choice, the director and lead designer of the series responded, "Not really. In a sequel," and this is a quote, okay, not really. In a sequel, in a sequel, you have to meet people's expectations, but you sort of also have to go against them and deceive them, I think. So this was part of the quote of the interview. So the designer deliberately deceived them to presumably have a new and different and surprising experience. Now, a third way in which designers can lie to their players for their own interest, interludically. So let's suppose that we know what certain genre conventions are, and well, a way to deceive your players could be that of subverting those conventions. I'm going to make a small example here. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, in the genre convention of action RPGs and RPGs, by which I mean role-playing games, a chest is normally considered to be a source of meaningful, important resources. So normally when a chest is presented to the player, it is done in a safe area, an area in which the players can enjoy the spoils of their efforts of traversing a dungeon or reaching a difficult place to reach within the game world. In Dark Souls, however, and a few other Japanese games before Dark Souls, admittedly, these chests are anything but rewarding or safe. As a matter of fact, there are monsters called mimics who are particularly strong, and they only pretend to be chests, right? So when the player approaches a mimic, the mimic will activate and start fighting the players or chewing on the player. In which way is this in the interest of players of Dark Souls? Well, you can understand, like, it's first of all a surprise. It is not the first chest you encounter. You, in this game at this point, met a number of different chests that respected the tradition. That chest is a positive container of useful resources. And then you get eaten and fought by a mimic at a certain point. So it's a surprising moment, which is great, because in Dark Souls you want to be, in a way, mistreated and surprised, which adds to the world feeling dangerous, hostile, and mysterious. So from that moment on, the players will stop trusting the designer even more, right? Will start to be suspicious of essentially everything in a game, which is the kind of feeling that the designers wanted, that you are always feeling like you're in danger, that you can never trust anything, that the world is mysterious and the only way is forward. And finally, we can cheat and deceive and misguide our players in a way that is transludic, meaning that it just goes against traditional game convention in a larger sense. I know that some of you here already played Necessary Evil, and that is one of my stupid philosophical experiments by which I try to switch the perspective, right? So in this game, which looks like a Japanese RPG, what's going to happen is that you are born as, well, a meaningless minion. By that, so that red little demon, by that I mean that you were born in a room waiting minutes and minutes to do something, but nothing is ever available for you. Objects do not react to your actions, and there's nothing you can do in this room apart from waiting for a knight, for example, that character in a blue suit, to come and fight you for some reason. At that point, it is clear to you that you are marginal to the process of the game and to its narrative, to the point that even the interface that you see up there with the hearts is not for you. It's the interface of somebody else, the knight that is supposed to fight you. The game does not allow you to continue as a player, even in the very remote case that you manage to defeat the knight. Why? Because this game world is not for you. It was not designed for you. Things do not respond to you. You're just part of the environment, so to speak. So in that way, like you have a bit of a surprise event, a surprise moment in relation to this game, and also the possibility of not playing the game as if it were something that you need to suspend your disbelief towards, but rather something that openly tells you, like, this is not for you, this is an artifact, this is built for somebody else, you mean nothing within this world. And supposedly that gives you, as a player, a different critical perspective towards games that the mindless, engaged one that you have when you play normally. Now, I presented you the 4 ways in which players can be deceived within game worlds. And they are going to be, again, explained in further detail and maybe in a way that is more academic in an upcoming paper that is currently under review called Ludic Unreliability and Deceptive Game Design. Before I finish, and I hope that you already got something out of it, I would like to present a couple more slides about this idea. So it might be interesting for you to know that in that paper, we propose a distinction between covert deceptions, so deceptions that work until they are revealed. So for example, the case of Waldo.io and Hellblade are precisely that kind of thing. You are going to play differently as a player only insofar as you don't know you're being deceived. So as soon as you know that you've been deceived and how the game actually functions, they stop functioning as a deceit. As I said, Shenhua was a good example of that. And there's also overt deceptions. So deceptions that have an effect, a positive effect, an effect in the interest of the player when the game reveals that you've been cheated. So not until the game keeps this hidden, but at the moment of revelation. I have a small example here that I hope you know and enjoy. And the example is taken from Undertale, which is an action role-playing game by Toby Fox, 2015. If you have not played it, it's a very popular, very well discussed in academia kind of game. So what is special about this game? About 3/4 to, or maybe just over half, the game reveals the meaning of the variables LV and EXP in the game. Why is that particularly strange? Well, in traditional RPGs and action RPGs, LV normally indicates the level, so the skill level of the character, and EXP indicates a level of experience. This initial assessment on the player's part is further reinforced as they observe that both the level and the experience grow when killing NPC, which is non-player characters. Only later in the game, as I told you, past half, the meaning of these two variables are clarified. LV corresponds to level of violence and EXP corresponds to execution points. So the player is informed at that point that they have unnecessarily killed sometimes innocent NPCs and ultimately that they're genocidal maniacs. This is an interesting twist, a narrative surprise that the player only receives upon the revelation of the deceit. So to conclude, now you know everything about deceptive design, or near everything. What is it good for, and how can I use it as a designer? In analogy with literature or movies, they can be used to create false paths and false expectations, red herrings that can get the players down a particular path that means nothing, but it's interesting, right? Like when you play games, sometimes you like to sort of infer certain intentions, imagine a solution, try it out, it doesn't work, and so on and so forth. It makes the game deeper and more interesting. As we've seen in a couple of examples, deceptive design can introduce elements of surprise and confusion in the players, meaning that if your game is supposed to be confusing or surprising at a certain point, which might be a good thing, then deceptive strategies are things you can use for that. And then there are two final ones that maybe are not very important for you at this point in your academic career, but again, they can function to, in a way, distance the player from the game artifact and allow them to take new critical perspectives towards them. I already showed you this one, but there's another one that you can play in case you want. It's called Mondo Medicals by Jonathan Soderstrom, which is all about surprise deception and the use of deception. Now, this is a not very often discussed topic in game design, and there's very little written about this. So I hope that this presentation was something fresh for you, that added something to your game design arsenal, and that I've been clear and easy enough to follow. Yeah, that's all I have for you for today. And I also wanted to remind you that when the paper will be out, it's going to be on my webpage, and you can access all of my material for free, because of course culture should be free, and if you have the interest, you can always reach out and I can give you more information. So thank you, Gilson, and thank you to everyone who decided to stick around until now, and I hope